When you picture a mountain blizzard killing people, you picture the cold, freezing wind, temperatures dropping past what the body can endure. You imagine people running out of firewood, or losing their way in whiteout, or freezing in their sleep. But in the high mining camps of Colorado, the storms that killed the most people were not the coldest. They were the warmest. Wet snow, falling without wind, bonding to whatever it touched, pressing down with a weight that turned cabin roofs into coffins. The dangers was not how cold the storm became. It was how heavy it became before anyone believed it was a storm. Two sisters understood this. The camp they tried to warn did not. Tamsin Vale had not planned to die in a mining camp she had never seen. Neither had Mara. But the mule went lame 2 miles short of Silverton, and the title paper in Tamsin's coat said Argent Spur, and Argent Spur sat 3 miles above Animas Forks at 11,200 feet, and the only thing waiting for them there was a half-recorded claim on a prospect called the Morning Lark that their dead father had never bothered to work. Their father had been a freighter. Their mother had been a laundress. Both had worked every camp between Lake City and Silverton, hauling ore and boiling sheets and saving nothing. 8 winters back, a mule lost its footing near Cinnamon Pass. The pack frame swung wide. Their father went over the edge first. Their mother tried to grab the lead rope and followed him down. Tamsin remembered the sound. Not a scream, but a scrape, hooves and rock and canvas tearing, and then silence so complete that the wind sounded like breathing. They were 14. They had no relatives in the territory. They had $11 in a tin box and a reputation as camp children nobody wanted to feed. Tavi Red Willow took them in. He was Nuaga Tuvipu, Ute, a tracker and meat hunter who lived outside the social boundaries of the camps he traded with. Their mother had once hidden him in a laundry tent when drunk vigilantes came looking for someone to blame after a storehouse fire. He remembered the debt. He paid it by raising 2 girls who were not his blood and teaching them things the camps did not value. How to read weather through stone. How to judge snow by weight instead of depth. How to listen when mountains changed their breathing. Now they were 22. Tavi had disappeared into the high country 2 months earlier, the way he sometimes did when the camps pressed too close. And the Morning Lark claim, filed by their father in 1879, ignored for 5 years, suddenly recorded by a county clerk clearing backlogs, required proof of occupancy through spring, or it reverted to open filing. $31, 2 wool blankets, 1 lame mule, a barometer wrapped in wool batting, a short-handled shovel, and a title paper that a man named Victor Price wanted to buy for $12. That was the math. Tamsin had scratched it onto the back of the title paper during the last mile of walking. Mara leading the mule by its halter, both of them soaked to the hip from crossing snowmelt drainage. $31 would not last a month in a camp where flour cost $4 a sack and firewood sold for $6 a cord. The claim itself was a hole in a hillside that had never produced enough color to justify a second blast. But it was the only thing their father had left them, and if they walked away, Price would file on it before the ink dried on their abandonment. They could not leave. The mule could not carry them. Silverton was 14 miles of broken trail. They had no money for passage on a freight wagon, and Price had already placed a debt notice on the claim. $12 in unpaid assessment fees that he had conveniently purchased from the county recorder's office. If they left, the debt consumed the claim. If they stayed, they had to survive. Argent Spur announced itself through sound before sight. Stamp mill hammers rang against wet rock. Mule teams brayed on the upper switchback. Someone was playing a fiddle badly inside a building that leaned 11 degrees off plumb. The camp was 23 structures, cabins, a bunkhouse, an assay office, a saloon, a boarding house, and Price's general store, arranged along a single mud street that ran parallel to a creek too loud to talk over. Most of the roofs were nearly flat, planked with rough-sawn timber, and covered with tar paper or split shakes. Old snow crust sat on them like gray felt, 8 inches deep on some, compacted and dirty. None of the buildings had been designed to last. All of them had lasted longer than anyone expected. Tamsin noticed the roofs first. Mara noticed the air. It was late March, and the air should have been cold and dry at this elevation. Instead, it felt thick, warm. The kind of warmth that did not belong above 11,000 feet in the San Juans. The kind that made Tamsin's barometer needle drop overnight and made the old snow on those flat roofs soften into something that gripped instead of shed. She said nothing yet. They needed a place to sleep before they needed to be right. The assay office doubled as the camp's informal court. Jory Karkik held authority there. Not elected, not appointed, but acknowledged the way a man is acknowledged when he has worked underground since boyhood and survived 3 tunnel collapses and still walks upright. He was 52, Cornish-born, a mine captain and timberman who had followed tin to copper to silver across 2 continents. His hands were scarred from drill steel. His left ear was half-gone from a black powder misfire in Redruth. When Tamsin and Mara presented their title paper, he looked at it the way a man looks at a bill he did not expect. "Morning, Lark," he said. He turned the paper over. "Your father was Eben Vale." "He was," Tamsin said. Eben Vale could not find color in a paint store. Karkik set the paper on the assay table. "That claim has 40 feet of drift and nothing to show. You cannot work it alone. You cannot afford a crew. You cannot winter here without structure, and the only structure on that claim is a roofless powder shed and a privy." "We are not here to mine," Tamsin said. "We are here to hold occupancy through spring." Karkik looked at her, then at Mara, who stood behind her sister, holding the barometer glass like a weapon, then back at Tamsin. "Occupancy requires shelter," he said. "Shelter requires timber. Timber requires money. And you have $31. $31! Karkik leaned back. The chair complained. "I have timbered mines for 30 years. Let me tell you what $31 buys at 11,000 feet. It buys a week of flour and a polite burial." Tamsin did not flinch. She had heard men dismiss her before. The camps were full of men who measured worth in calluses and ore weight, and 2 young women with a dead freighter's title paper did not register on that scale. But she had not come here to be measured. "We are not asking for help," she said. "We are asking if you will witness our occupancy filing." Karkik signed the paper. He did it the way a man signs a death certificate, with pity, not malice. As they left, he said one more thing, and it was the thing that stayed. "Snow breaks men in slides, not roofs. You brace drifts, not shanties. Whatever you think you know about winter up here, you learned it lower down." The cabin on the Morning Lark claim was not a cabin. It was 3 walls of green timber, a dirt floor, and a canvas sheet where the 4th wall should have been. The roof was 6 planks laid flat across ridgepoles that had already begun to bow. Someone had started building it and stopped, probably when the assay results came back empty. Inside, a rusted stove with no pipe, a crate of square nails half-eaten by moisture, and a copy of the Rocky Mountain News from 1881 folded into a door shim. Mara set the barometer on the crate and watched the needle. It had dropped again since morning. She pressed her palm against the north wall the way Tavi had taught them. Not for temperature, but for moisture. The wood was sweating. At this elevation, in late March, wood should have been dry enough to crack. "How much time?" Mara asked. Tamsin looked at the sky. The clouds were not moving. They were thickening from below, which meant moisture was climbing the valleys and compressing against the peaks. She had seen this pattern once before, near Are, when she was 16. Tavi had pulled them off a ridge trail 3 hours before a storm dropped 4 feet of snow, so wet it bent fence posts. 3 days, Tamsin said, maybe 4. And it will not be powder. What will it be? Tamsin picked up a handful of the old crust from the roof edge. It was dense and gray, compacted by weeks of freeze-thaw cycling. She squeezed it. Water ran between her fingers. "Heavy," she said. "Wet, the kind that does not slide off a flat roof. The kind that bonds to old crust and turns into." She stopped. The miners had a word for it, or rather they did not have a word because they did not believe it existed. Snow that fell wet and packed itself under its own weight until it behaved less like snow and more like soaked earth. Tavi had called it stone water. The miners who had never seen it called it nonsense. "Concrete snow," Mara said. Tamsin nodded. She sat on the dirt floor and pulled the title paper from her coat. On the back, where she had already scratched the supply math, she began scratching new numbers. 6 feet of wet snow at a 6-to-1 snow-water ratio meant roughly 12 inches of water per square foot of surface. 12 inches of water over 1 square foot weighed about 62 pounds. A cabin roof 16 feet by 24 feet had 384 square feet of surface. 384 times 62. She stopped scratching and looked at Mara. 23,000 pounds, she said, before drifting, before wind loading, on roofs built to carry men, not mountains. Mara looked out through the canvas wall at the camp below. 23 cabins with flat or low-pitched roofs, 8 inches of old crust already bonded to the shakes. No spare timber for reinforcement. 3 days before the pressure bottomed out. "We have to tell them," Mara said. They told them. And the telling went exactly as badly as Tamsin expected. She stood on a packing crate outside the assay office at dusk, Mara beside her holding the barometer glass, and she explained the math to every face that paused in the mud street. She used small words. She used numbers. She said, 6 feet of wet snow at a heavy ratio would put more weight on their roofs than most of those roofs were built to carry. She said the old crust would bond with new snow and create a single mass that could not be shoveled fast enough. She said they needed to brace every flat roof with center posts under the ridge beams, shovel the old crust before new snow arrived, and move children and sick men to the assay cellar or to cover underground. Karkik listened from the doorway. He did not interrupt at first. He watched the way a teacher watches a student solving a problem wrong, with patience and a little sadness. "How old are you?" he asked when she paused for breath. 22. "And you have been above 11,000 feet for how long?" "Since this morning." Karkik stepped into the street. The crowd, 15 men, 3 women, a cluster of children, shifted to watch him because authority moves like gravity in a small camp. "I have seen wet cycles," he said. 1881 was a wet spring. Snow came heavy and we shoveled it. That is what you do with snow. You shovel it. You do not panic a camp into abandoning wage work to brace roofs against a prediction made by 2 girls with a barometer and no mining experience. A murmur ran through the crowd. Heads nodded. Karkik was reasonable. His experience was real. And the math Tamsin had scratched was just numbers, abstractions that meant nothing to men who had survived storms by doing what they had always done. Then Victor Price stepped out of his store. He was 41, lean-jawed, with the kind of neatness that felt calculated. His boots were oiled. His ledger was always visible, tucked under his arm like a Bible. He was the claim broker, the credit holder, the informal banker, the man who bought distressed shares for cents and resold them to Eastern investors at dollars. He smiled the way a man smiles when someone else is losing. "Miss Vale," he said, "you have been in this camp for 9 hours. In that time, you have filed a claim on a worthless prospect, refused a fair purchase offer, and now you are telling wage-earning men to stop work and nail posts to their ceilings because you believe snow can turn to stone." Mara stepped forward. She held a fistful of wet snow she had scooped from the nearest roof edge. She threw it hard against the plank wall of Price's store. It hit with a thick, heavy slap and stuck. It did not scatter. It did not powder away. It clung to the wood like thrown mud. "That is 8-inch-old crust," Mara said. 3 days from now, 6 feet of that will be sitting on your roof. Do the math or do not. But do not call us liars because the answer frightens you. Men laughed. Not all of them, but enough. The laughter was not cruel. It was the laughter of men who had heard warnings before and survived anyway. The laughter of people who do not believe the world can change faster than their experience predicts. Price did not laugh. He calculated. A camp that panicked was a camp that stopped spending. A camp that stopped spending did not need a credit broker. And 2 young women drawing attention to structural weakness drew attention to the fact that Price's store had the steepest roof in camp because Price had built it with his own money and his own caution, while the cabins he rented to miners had the flattest roofs and the cheapest timber. "A camp that runs from weather," Price said, loud enough for everyone, "is a camp that investors never return to. I will not have my business disrupted by schoolhouse panic." Tamsin looked at the faces around her. She looked for one person who believed. She found Ida Marsh, 36, boarding house cook, standing in the doorway with flour on her apron and a 7-year-old girl pressed against her hip. Ida's face was not mocking. It was not believing either. It was the face of a woman who had learned that being right and being safe were not the same thing in a camp run by men with ledgers. Tamsin stepped off the crate. There was nothing more to say. The camp had heard her. The camp had chosen. The deputy came at dawn. He was young and uncomfortable, and he carried a paper from Price. Not an eviction, not exactly, but a disturbance complaint that gave him grounds to escort the sisters to the camp boundary. Price had framed the warning as economic sabotage. The deputy framed it as keeping the peace. They loaded the mule. Mara coiled the rawhide rope over one shoulder and carried the barometer glass against her chest. Tamsin carried the shovel and the title paper and the $31 that would not buy them a week. Ida Marsh watched from the boarding house window. She did not come outside. She did not wave. She stood behind glass and watched, and her silence was louder than every laugh in the street the night before. The sisters walked uphill, past the last cabin, past the tailings pile, past the creek crossing where ice still bridged the shallows. They walked until the camp was below them and the mountain was above them, and the only sound was wind pushing through spruce too dense to see through. They were alone. They were expelled, and the storm was 3 days away. The Blue Mercy adit opened in the hillside like a mouth that had forgotten how to close. It was a horizontal cut, not a vertical shaft, but a tunnel driven straight into competent rock by someone chasing a silver vein that had petered out 40 feet in. The opening was broad, shoulder high at the lip, framed with rotting timber headers that sagged but held. Beyond the headers, the tunnel widened into a passage that ran 140 feet into the mountain before opening into a dry chamber, where the ceiling rose to 8 feet and the walls wept mineral water in slow orange streaks. Tamsin had found it on their walk-up. She had smelled it first, the cold mineral damp that Tavi had taught her to recognize, the breath of underground space pushing through cracks. She had stopped. She had knelt at the opening and held her palm flat against the rock face, the way Tavi had pressed her hand against a cave wall when she was 15, and said, "The mountain speaks first through water, then through pressure, then through animals going quiet." The rock was cool, steady, not cold the way surface stone gets cold, not reactive to wind or sun. This was the temperature of depth, the kind of cold that does not change because it comes from so far inside that seasons cannot reach it. At the back chamber, where the mineral water seeped, the air held near 51 degrees. Outside, the wind cut at 29. The adit had one dangerous feature, that broad entrance, wide enough to seal with snow if a storm packed it. And it had the risks that every abandoned mine carries. The possibility of bad air, unstable roof rock, hidden shafts beneath rotted floor timber. Tamsin knew these risks because Tavi had taught them, and because Tavi had also taught her how to test. She held a candle at the entrance and watched the flame. It leaned inward, drawn by the air moving through the tunnel, not guttering, not dying, but bending toward a crack somewhere deeper that connected to outside air. She checked the soot marks on the ceiling timber. Old soot, laid down by previous miners' candles, streaked toward the back chamber in a pattern that showed consistent airflow. She ran her fingers along the mineral line on the wall, the high water mark of seepage, and found aught dry above waist height and stable below. Not safe. No abandoned mine was safe, but survivable if you understood what you were entering. "The mountain will carry the weight," Tamsin said. Mara understood immediately. Rock does not collapse under snow. Rock does not care about 6 feet or 12 feet or 20 feet. A cabin roof is a man's guess at what holds. A mountain is the thing that holds everything. The idea was simple. The execution would break them. They would build a dry-stacked stone bulkhead across most of the adit mouth, 5 feet thick at the base, narrowing to 3 feet at shoulder height, using angular talus that would bite under load instead of rounded river stones that would roll. They would leave a small angled timber door, 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, set in a wedge-shaped frame so that pressure from outside pushed the door harder into its jambs instead of blowing it open. They would cut a low air channel and a high vent, both dog-legged through the stone to allow airflow while preventing direct snowpacking. They would store food and lamps in the back chamber. They would dig a drainage trench along the left wall for meltwater, and then they would seal themselves inside and wait for the mountain to prove them right or bury them wrong. Mara did not argue with the design. She argued with the odds. If we are wrong, she said, we die in a hole that no one will dig us out of. If we are right, we survive inside a mountain while everyone who laughed at us dies under flat roofs we told them to brace. We told them, Tamsin said. They chose. They chose because they did not believe us. That is not the same as choosing to die. This was the weight that would sit on Tamsin's chest for the next 3 days, heavier than any snow. They had warned the camp. The camp had expelled them. And now they had to decide whether surviving alone was enough, or whether they had an obligation to keep the door open for people who had called them liars. She did not answer Mara. She picked up the shovel. Ida Marsh arrived at the adit at midday, breathing hard from the climb, carrying a canvas sack that clinked with lamp oil tins. She looked at the tunnel entrance. She looked at the sisters, already clearing the trench line with the short-handled shovel. She set the sack down. I think you are choosing a tomb, she said. You cannot eat stone. You cannot breathe through snow. And if that roof inside comes down, no one will hear you scream. The roof is rock, Tamsin said. It has held for longer than any of us have been alive. Rock falls in mines. Men die in mines. There is a reason those tunnels have warnings nailed to their headers. Tamsin did not dismiss her. Ida's fear was the same fear that any reasonable person would carry into an abandoned mine. Bad air could accumulate in dead-end passages. Roofed timber could rot and drop without warning. Floor planks could hide shafts that dropped 50 feet into black water. These were not superstitions. They were documented realities that killed miners who knew what they were doing, let alone 2 women who had never swung a drill. We tested the air, Tamsin said. She struck a match and held it at the entrance. The flame leaned inward, steady. See the draw? Air moves through this tunnel. There is a connection to outside deeper in, a crack or a second opening. The flame does not lie. Flame tests are not perfect, Mara added, because honesty mattered more than salesmanship. Bad air can sit in pockets that a candle does not reach. But the soot marks on the ceiling show consistent airflow for years. And the mineral line is stable. No flooding history above the trench line. Ida looked at the flame. She looked at the soot. She did not look convinced, but she looked less certain in her doubt. I brought lamp oil, she said, and 20 pounds of beans, not because I believe you, because if you die in there, I want to know I fed you first. She left before they could thank her. She walked downhill toward the camp without looking back, and the canvas sack sat on the rock like a verdict that had not yet been delivered. The sisters began hauling stone. There was no trick to it, no shortcut. Angular talus lay scattered across the slope above the adit, chunks of fractured rock that had calved from the cliff face over decades of frost wedging. Each piece weighed between 15 and 80 pounds. Each piece had to be carried downslope, fitted against its neighbors, and checked for stability before the next piece went on top. The wall needed to be 5 feet thick at the base. The base was 12 feet across. 5 feet thick, 12 feet across, shoulder high. Tamsin calculated the volume in her head and stopped calculating because the number was the kind of number that makes people quit. They carried stone. They stacked stone. They carried more stone. Mara's fingernails tore on the second load. Tamsin's palms split on the fourth. The mules stood lame-legged near the creek and watched them with the disinterested patience of an animal that has stopped understanding human decisions. By the end of the first day, they had cleared the trench, leveled the foundation line, and set the first 2 feet of wall. It was not enough. It was not close to enough. But it was stone on stone, and it was not going to move. The barometer dropped again overnight. Tamsin checked it by candlelight in the back chamber, where the air held warm and the mineral water ticked against rock in a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. The needle had fallen further than she expected. The pressure was collapsing the way it collapses before the kind of storm that rewrites the landscape. 3 days, maybe less. and the wall needed 3 more feet of height, a door frame, 2 vent channels, and enough food to last a week if the entrance sealed. She lay on the rock floor and listened to the mountain breathe and tried not to count the hours she did not have. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who did not understand what you were building? Tell us in the comments, because what happens next in this story will feel familiar to anyone who has ever been told their preparation was panic. Outside, the clouds thickened. The air stayed wrong, warm, wet, heavy with moisture that had no business being at 11,000 feet in late March. Snow fleas crawled up through the old crust on the cabin roofs below. Ravens that should have been circling at ridge height were feeding in the creek willows, low and nervous. The mountain was speaking. The camp was not listening, and the sisters had 2 days to finish a wall that should have taken a week. The second morning broke gray and still. No wind. No sound from the camp below except the stamp mill, which ran regardless of weather because ore does not care about clouds. Tamsin and Mara ate cold beans from the sack Ida had brought and started hauling before the light was strong enough to see the trail. They had worked out a rhythm. Mara carried, Tamsin fitted. Mara had the stronger back. Tamsin had the better eye for how stone met stone. They did not talk while they worked because talking used energy, and energy was the one resource they could not replace. The only sounds were boot scrape, stone thud, breath. By midday, the wall was 4 feet high across most of its width. The door frame was the next problem. They needed timber, 2 uprights, and a lintel, plus a wedge-shaped door that would seat tighter under pressure. The only usable timber was the header framing at the adit mouth, which was rotting but still dimensional. Tamsin measured with her arm span, 3 feet high, 2 feet wide, angled inward so the mountainside was wider than the outside face. When snow pressed against it, the door would wedge deeper into the frame instead of blowing inward. She found iron strap hinges on an abandoned ore chute 50 yards upslope. 2 of the 3 were still sound. The third snapped when she tried to bend it straight. 2 hinges on a door that needed 3. "We use rawhide for the third point," Mara said. "Lash it tight and let it swell when it gets wet. It will hold." It was the kind of solution Tavi would have approved. Not elegant, not permanent, but functional under pressure. They cut the door from a spruce plank that had been a shelf in the powder shed, trimmed it with the shovel blade used as a draw knife, and hung it in the frame by late afternoon. The high vent was easier. A gap in the stone course near the top of the wall, dog-legged twice so snow could not pack straight through, lined with flat shale to keep the opening from shifting. They tested it with the candle. The flame leaned. Air moved. The low vent was harder. It needed to sit near ground level, where snow pressure would be greatest, and it needed to resist plugging. Tamsin built it as a narrow stone channel, angled downward toward the outside, so meltwater would drain out instead of pooling in. She packed clay around the outer face and let it set. Night came. The wall stood 5 feet high at the base, tapering to 3.5 feet at the door frame. The door fit. The vents breathed. The drainage trench ran clean. It was not finished. The top course needed another row of heavy stone to lock the wall against lateral pressure. The food cache was short by at least 2 days. The mule needed to be moved to lower ground, or it would die in the open. And the barometer needle, when Tamsin checked it by the last of the lamp oil light, had dropped so far that the calibration mark was above it. 2 days had become 1, maybe less. The pressure was falling off a cliff. Tamsin sat in the back chamber, with her hands wrapped in strips of wool blanket, her palms cracked and bleeding, her shoulders burning from 180 basket loads of stone that she had carried, fitted, and carried again. Mara sat beside her, already half asleep, 2 fingernails missing, and the rest blackened with clay and blood. They had built a wall against a mountain. Now the mountain would decide if the wall was enough. The air outside was perfectly still, warm, thick, with moisture that pressed against the skin like wet cloth. Somewhere below, in the camp, men were playing cards and drinking coffee and laughing at the idea that snow could turn to stone. Somewhere below, Ida Marsh was watching the sky through boarding house glass and wondering whether 20 pounds of beans had been charity or a funeral offering. Somewhere below, the roofs waited, flat heavy with old crust, built by men who had survived every storm by doing what they had always done. The first flakes would come by morning, and they would not be powder. Tavi Red Willow came at dusk on the second evening, moving uphill through spruce shadow on snowshoes that made no sound against the crust. He was 61, lean in the way that age strips men who have never carried excess, not thin from deprivation, but reduced to the essential architecture of bone and tendon and quiet endurance. His left leg dragged slightly where a cavalry saber had cut the muscles above the knee 20 years earlier, a wound he never explained except to say that the man who gave it to him had not survived the exchange. He wore elk hide and a wool shirt that had been patched so many times the original fabric was a theory. His hair was iron gray and tied with a strip of deer hide. He carried a pack frame loaded with smoked venison, a hand axe, and a coil of rawhide lashing. He did not announce himself. He stood at the edge of the firelight. Tamsin had risked a small fire in the adit mouth to warm their hands between stone loads, and waited until Mara looked up and said his name. Tavi. He set the pack frame down and looked at the wall. He walked its length, running his fingers along the stone courses the way a man reads a letter written in a language he knows better than the writer. He touched the door frame. He leaned into the high vent and listened. He crouched at the low vent and held his palm over the opening. Then he picked up a rounded stone from the second course, near the left edge, and dropped it on the ground. River stone, he said. Smooth, it will slide under load. Pull it. Tamsin stared at the stone she had hauled 60 yards downslope and fitted with aching hands. She had chosen it because it was the right size, and she had been too tired to climb higher for angular talus. Pull it, Tavi said again, and the three beside it. Smooth stone in a pressure wall is a bullet waiting to fire. She pulled them. Her palms screamed. She climbed the slope in near darkness and brought back 4 pieces of fractured talus with sharp edges that bit into her hands but would bite into each other under load. By the time she had refitted the course, Tavi had already found 2 more rounded stones in the base course and marked them with charcoal. He did not explain his arrival. He did not need to. He had been living above Animus Forks for weeks, trading venison and trail knowledge to miners who respected his skills while despising his presence. The San Juan silver camps sat on land that had been Ute territory until the Bruneau Agreement pushed the boundary west in 1873, opening millions of acres to the same prospectors who now treated Tavi as a curiosity at best and a threat at worst. He understood the politics of his position. He stayed because the mountains were his, regardless of what papers said, and he left when the camps pressed too close. He had heard about the expulsion from a freight driver on the Animus Forks switchback. He had come because he raised these women and because he recognized what they were reading in the sky, and because the camp that mocked him would still need saving, and saving it was not something he could do alone. The wall wants a batter, he said, crouching at the base. Lean it inward, toward the mountain, 3 degrees. It is already vertical, Tamsin said. Vertical holds against gravity. But pressure comes from the side, wet snowpacks against the face and pushes. If the wall leans into the mountain, pressure tightens the stones instead of rolling them. The mountain becomes the backstop. He demonstrated with 2 stones on the ground, tilting one against a boulder. He pressed the tilted stone from the front. It wedged tighter. He pressed a vertical stone from the front. It tipped. Tamsin understood. The principle was the same as the wedge-shaped door. Use the force against itself. She looked at the wall they had spent 2 days building. The lower courses were vertical. They would need to shim the upper courses to create the lean. How much time does that cost? She asked. Less than rebuilding after it fails, Tavi said. They worked through the night. Tavi moved slower than the sisters, but placed every stone with a precision that made their work look careless. He rejected stones by feel, too smooth, too round, wrong grain, fracture plane in the wrong direction. He tested each placement by pressing his shoulder against the course and pushing. If anything shifted, he pulled it and started over. At midnight, Mara's hands were shaking too badly to grip stone. Tavi sent her to the back chamber to sleep. He and Tamsin continued. Between loads, he taught. You tested the air with a candle, he said. That shows flow. It does not show what flows. The soot marks show consistent ventilation. Years of it. Soot shows where smoke went. It does not promise where air comes from tomorrow. Bad air can pool in low places when pressure changes. After the storm seals the entrance, you check the candle every hour. If it dims, you open the high vent wider. If it dies, you dig. He showed her something she had not seen before, a smoke-blackened strip of wool tied to a willow stick. He lit the wool's edge and blew it out. The ember glowed and produced a thin line of smoke. He held it at knee height inside the tunnel. The smoke drifted inward and upward, following the airflow toward the crack at the back. He moved it to a low pocket along the right wall. The smoke pooled and sat. No movement. Dead pocket, he said. Stay out of it. Sleep on the left side, near the trench where the flow runs. He taught silence discipline next. Not the silence of being quiet, but the discipline of stillness when sealed underground. Every breath consumed air. Every movement generated heat that consumed air. Panic consumed air faster than cold. If the entrance sealed and the vents narrowed, the difference between life and death would be measured in breaths per minute. And the person who controlled their breathing would outlast the person who did not. Count your breaths, he said. 10 in, 10 out. If you cannot count, you are panicking. If you are panicking, you are dying faster. Tamsin filed it the way she filed everything Tavi taught, not as theory, but as instruction she might need before dawn. The third morning arrived without a sunrise. The sky was a single gray lid pressed against the peaks, no wind. The silence had the quality of held breath, as if the mountain itself was waiting. The barometer needle sat below the lowest calibration mark Tamsin had ever seen on the glass. She tapped the instrument. The needle did not move. The wall was close. The upper courses leaned inward at the angle Tavi had set, shimmed with flat shale wedges. The door hung on 2 iron hinges and 1 rawhide lashing, fitted tight in its wedge frame. Both vents were open and breathing. The drainage trench ran clean along the left wall to a low point that would carry meltwater toward the entrance. The back chamber held 3 bedrolls, Tavi's elk hide, the sisters' wool blankets, 2 water barrels filled from the mineral seep, Ida's sack of beans, a sack of flour Tavi had brought, lamp oil, 1 shovel, 1 pick, and a chalk mark on the wall showing expected snow pressure height. Tamsin stood outside the adit and looked at the finished wall. It was ugly. It was uneven at the top course, patched with clay on the outer face, stained with bloody handprints where she had gripped stone without feeling the cuts. It looked like something built by desperate people in the dark, which was exactly what it was. It also looked like it would hold. A small wet squall hit mid-morning, the kind of weather that in another season would have been rain. Snow fell in heavy clumps that hit the ground and stayed. It packed against the outer face of the stone wall. Tamsin watched from inside through the cracked door. The wall did not shift. The snow did not slide off. It bonded to the clay surface and began building a layer that pressed inward. The door sat a fraction tighter in its frame. The high vent breathed. The candle flame leaned toward the back chamber, steady and clean. The interior held near 51 degrees. Outside, the temperature was dropping through the 20s, but inside the adit, the rock radiated the slow, patient warmth of a mountain that had been absorbing summer heat for millions of years. Tavi checked the low vent. Snow had not yet reached it. He cleared the outer opening with a stick and packed a small stone baffle in front of it to deflect direct packing. It works, Mara said. It works against a squall, Tavi corrected. The storm will weigh 20 times this. Karkik came in the afternoon. He climbed the slope alone, hands in his coat pockets, moving with the heavy deliberation of a man who has decided to see something he does not want to see. He stood 10 feet from the wall and studied it without speaking. He walked its length. He pressed his palm flat against the stone face. He looked at the batter angle, the door frame, the vent openings. You leaned it, he said. Tavi showed us the batter, Tamsin said. Karkik glanced at Tavi, who stood near the adit mouth with his arms crossed. 2 men measuring each other, the Cornish timberman, who trusted wood, and the Ute tracker, who trusted stone. They did not speak to each other. They did not need to. Each recognized competence in the other and resented the recognition. The stonework is not foolish, Karkik said. He addressed this to Tamsin, not Tavi. The principle is sound. Pressure against a battered wall tightens the mass. Any miner knows that from shaft collar construction. Then brace the cabin roofs, Tamsin said. You have time. Not much, but enough to set center posts under the ridge beams. Karkik looked down at the camp. 23 structures, flat roofs sagging under old crust. Men moving in the street who had already dismissed the warning and would not hear it again from a man who had just inspected the thing they were mocking. Price has gathered men around him, Karkik said. If I order roof bracing, I lose authority. If I lose authority, I cannot organize anything when the real crisis comes. This is the real crisis, Mara said. You do not know that. You believe it. There is a difference, and the difference is what I stake my name on. He left without ordering anything. He walked downhill with his hands still in his pockets, and Tamsin watched him go and understood something she had not understood before. Karkik was not stupid. He was not ignorant. He was afraid of being wrong in public, and that fear was more dangerous than any storm. The snow began in the late afternoon. Not the squall from morning. This was different. This fell as rain at the lowest cabins, fat drops that hit canvas and wood with a sound like thrown gravel. Then it thickened. The rain became sleet. The sleet became snow, but the snow was wrong. Each flake landed heavy, wet, and stuck to whatever it touched. Roofs, coats, mule hair, tree bark. It did not drift. It did not scatter in wind, because there was no wind. It fell straight down in a column of white that was so dense the lanterns in camp became yellow smears within an hour. Tamsin stood at the adit entrance and watched. She held her palm out and caught a fistful. She squeezed. Water poured between her fingers. The snow-water ratio was worse than she had calculated. Not 6-1. Closer to 5-1. Heavier. Inside, Tavi said. They sealed the door. Tamsin set the wedge pin, a tapered oak dowel that locked the door into the frame from inside. The iron hinges took the weight. The rawhide lashing on the third point swelled as moisture hit it, exactly as Mara had predicted, and tightened against the frame. The last thing Tamsin saw before the door closed was the camp below. Lanterns flickering, a man crossing the street hunched against the snow, horses tied under a lean-to that was already bowing. The old crust on the roofs was softening. She could see it from the hillside, the gray surface turning dark as new snow bonded to it, wet merging with wet, and the combined mass beginning to sag the weakest timbers. She pulled the door shut, the wedge pin seated. The sound of the storm became a whisper against 5 feet of stone. Inside the Blue Mercy, time collapsed into lamplight and breath. Tavi set the discipline immediately. 1 lamp lit at a time, no unnecessary movement, voices low, breathing counted. He chalked a mark on the wall for each hour, estimated by the burn rate of lamp oil. He assigned positions, Tamsin near the high vent with the willow rod and spoon for clearing, Mara near the door with the shovel, Tavi in the middle, listening. The first hour passed in near silence. Snow accumulated against the outer wall in a sound that was not a sound, a slow, continuous pressure that Tamsin felt more than heard, the way you feel water rising against a dam. The wall did not shift. The door did not creak. The stone absorbed the pressure and transferred it to the mountain behind, exactly as the batter was designed to do. The second hour, the low vent changed pitch. The whisper of air through the dogleg channel deepened and then stopped. Snow had reached the outer opening and packed it. Tamsin held the smoking wool strip at the low vent mouth. No movement. She moved it to the high vent. Smoke drifted inward and upward, still drawing. 1 channel is enough, Tavi said. For now, conserve the oil. They doused the lamp and sat in darkness. The darkness inside a mountain is absolute, not the darkness of a room with curtains drawn, but the darkness of a place where light has never existed. Tamsin's eyes found nothing. She heard Mara's breathing to her left, Tavi's to her right, and the slow tick of mineral water deeper in the chamber. She counted breaths. 10 in, 10 out. The third hour, the first sound from outside reached them. Not through the vents, through the rock itself. A low, grinding moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A sound that vibrated in Tamsin's teeth and the bones of her hands where they pressed against the floor. Roof timber, Tavi said in the darkness, somewhere below bending. The moan lasted 4 seconds. Then a sound like a cough, deep, percussive, final, and then a rushing noise that faded into the white static of falling snow. The assay shed. It had to be the assay shed. It had the flattest roof and the widest span. Tamsin pictured the building in her mind. The table where Karkik had signed their title paper, the chair that complained under his weight, the shelves of sample jars, the iron stove, all of it now under a mass of wet snow that had folded the roof like a man folding a newspaper. Karkik, Mara whispered. He was not in the assay office, Tamsin said. She did not know this. She said it because Mara needed to hear it. By the 5th hour, 3 more sounds had reached them through the rock. Each was different. The bunkhouse went with a series of cracks, sharp, fast, like rifle shots, followed by a long exhalation of compressed air escaping through broken seams. One of the smaller cabins went quietly, a single deep thud that could have been a tree falling if there had been wind to push it. The third sound was the worst, because it was not a building. It was a voice. Someone shouting, muffled by distance and snow and stone, but unmistakably human and unmistakably terrified. Mara stood up. Tamsin heard her boots scrape against the rock floor. We have to open the door, Mara said. No. Tavi's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Wet snow behaves like weight and water together. If you open the door, the snow that is packed against it fills the entrance. Once it fills, you cannot close it again. The vents seal. We suffocate. Someone is dying out there. People are dying in many places tonight. We cannot save them by dying with them. The voice outside stopped. Whether it stopped because the person found shelter, or because the person stopped being able to shout, Tamsin did not know. She pressed her palms against the rock floor and felt the mountain's cold patience and tried to breathe, at the rate Tavi had taught her, and failed. Her count reached 6 before her lungs demanded more. Tamsin. Tavi's hand found her shoulder in the darkness. Count, she counted. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, she held. The air moved through the high vent in a thin stream she could feel on her face, cold and steady, carrying the mineral smell of wet rock and the faint, impossible sweetness of pine resin from somewhere outside. The candle flame, they relit it at the 6th hour, leaned toward the back chamber. Steady. The high vent was holding. The air was moving. They were alive because the mountain was breathing for them. The 8th hour brought Ida Marsh. Tamsin did not hear the knocking at first. The sound was so small against the mass of snow and stone that it registered as mineral tick, water drip, rock settling. But it repeated. 3 soft impacts, then a pause, then 3 more. Mara heard it too. That is not stone, Mara said. They listened. 3 more taps. And then, barely audible, a voice. High-pitched, thin, a child's voice carried through 5 feet of stone and however many feet of snow had packed against it. Please. Mara was at the door before Tamsin could speak. She pulled the wedge pin. The door moved half an inch inward under the snow pressure outside, then stopped against the frame exactly as designed. The wedge shape held. The pressure seated it tighter. But the half-inch gap was enough. A strip of gray light appeared along the edge, and with it, cold air and the sound of a woman weeping. Ida, Tamsin said. They opened the door together, Mara and Tamsin on the inside, pulling while Tavi braced the frame with his shoulder. The snow had packed 3 feet deep against the outer face. The door opened into a pocket, a space where the recessed entry and the stone wall's overhang had prevented full packing. In that pocket, on her knees in wet snow, Ida Marsh held 7-year-old Millie Hask against her chest. Millie's face was flushed with fever. Ida's was white with terror. The boarding house porch went, Ida said. I could not reach the street. I carried her uphill because uphill was the only direction without debris. They pulled Ida and Millie through the door. The frame shifted half an inch under the changed pressure. Tavi slammed the wedge pin back into place with his palm, and the oak bit into the wood and held. Snow had entered the gap, 2 handfuls of dense, wet pack that Mara swept back with the shovel blade. The door held. But the frame had moved, and the rawhide lashing on the 3rd hinge point had stretched a 1/4 inch. Tamsin saw it in the lamplight. She said nothing. She wrapped a 2nd loop of rawhide around the hinge bracket and pulled it tight. Millie was burning with fever. Ida had wrapped her in a quilt that was now soaked through. Mara stripped the quilt, dried Millie with a wool blanket, and laid her on the elk hide near the back wall where the rock held its steady 51 degrees. The warmth of the stone and the still air began working immediately, not healing, but stabilizing, pulling the child's shivering body towards a temperature that the mountain had maintained for millennia. "How bad is the camp?" Tamsin asked. Ida shook her head. She could not speak yet. Her hands were trembling so badly that the lamp oil tin she had carried, the last one from her boarding house kitchen, rattled against the stone floor. "The assay shed went first," she said finally. "Then the bunkhouse. The sound? I have never heard wood make that sound. Like it was alive and dying." If you are invested in what happens next, hit subscribe and stay, because the Sisters' Refuge has survived the snow, but the air inside is running on a single vent, and the camp below is going silent. "Who was shouting?" Mara asked. "I do not know. The snow was too thick. I could not see my own feet." Tavi checked the vents. The low channel was completely sealed. The high vent was narrowing. Snow had crept up the outer face and was beginning to pack into the first dogleg. He held the smoking wool strip at the opening. The smoke moved, but slowly. The airflow had dropped by half. "Tamsin," he said. "The high vent." She took the willow rod, a straight branch, 4 feet long, with a spoon lashed to the end with sinew. She climbed the inner face of the stone wall, her boots finding purchase on the rough talus edges, and fed the rod into the high vent channel. The first dogleg was clear. The second was packed. She pushed the spoon through compressed snow, twisting and scraping, and felt the resistance give way in a sudden release of cold air that hit her face like a slap. The candle flame jumped, the smoke strip danced, air moving. "How often?" she asked Tavi. "Every hour," he said. "If you sleep, you set a count. 100 breaths between checks. If you lose count, check immediately. 5 people in a space designed for 3. 2 lamps instead of 1. A child with fever breathing fast. The air budget had changed." Tamsin looked at the candle flame and understood that the rest of the night would be measured in the angle of that flame and the color of its tip, and that if the tip turned blue and the angle dropped, she would have minutes to clear the vent, or they would all stop breathing in the same warm, dark, quiet chamber that was keeping them alive. The 11th hour was the worst. The snow outside had not stopped. The sound against the wall had changed from a whisper to a presence, a continuous slow pressure that Tamsin felt in her spine when she pressed her back against the stone. The wall held. The batter held. Every stone that Tavi had made her replace was doing its work, biting into its neighbors, transferring force to the mountain. But the doorframe had shifted again. The half-inch had become 3/4. The rawhide was stretching. Tavi wedged a stone against the inner face of the doorframe, pressing it tighter into the wall. The stone held. The frame stopped moving. But the gap along the upper edge now admitted a thin line of gray. Not light exactly, but less darkness. The faint illumination of snow packed so densely that it transmitted a ghost of whatever light existed above it. Through that gap, cold air seeped, not the flowing air of the vent, but the dead, heavy cold of compressed snow. Tamsin packed the gap with strips of wool blanket, pressing them in with the shovel handle. The cold stopped. The seal held. At the 12th hour, another sound came through the rock. Not a building this time, not a voice. A long, slow, grinding roar, deep enough to feel in the chest, that built and then released in a percussive wave that shook loose a chip of rock from the adit ceiling. It pinged off the floor near Millie's head. Mara covered the child with her body. Slide, not a roof collapse. An avalanche somewhere on the peaks above, triggered by the sheer weight of wet snow on slopes that had been stable for decades. The sound lasted 8 seconds. Then silence. Then the mineral water in the back chamber stopped ticking. It resumed 30 seconds later. But those seconds, when the mountain itself had gone quiet, were the longest of Tamsin's life. Dawn came as a theory, not a fact. The high vent admitted marginally warmer air. The gray line along the door frame brightened by 1 degree. There was no sunrise to see, no birdsong, no sound of stamp mills or mule teams. The world outside the stone wall was snow and silence. Tamsin cleared the high vent for the 9th time. The spoon came back packed with snow, so dense it held the shape of the channel. She crumbled it in her hand. The water ran heavy. She estimated the snow water equivalent at close to 5-1, worse than her calculations, worse than the worst figure she had given Karkik, worse than any wet snow event she had read about or Tavi had described. 6 feet of snow at 5-1 meant nearly 15 inches of water per square foot. 15 inches of water at 5.2 pounds per inch meant roughly 78 pounds per square foot. On a 16 by 24 foot cabin roof, that was nearly 30,000 pounds before drifting, before the weight of old crust bonded to the new load. The number was beyond what any structure in Argent Spur had been built to carry. She said the number to Tavi. He said nothing. He was sitting near the back wall with his eyes closed, breathing at the count of 10, conserving air the way he conserved everything, with the patience of a man who had lost his homeland and kept living. Because living was the discipline he chose. Millie's fever had broken. The child slept with her thumb in her mouth and her face pressed against the elk hide. Ida sat beside her, awake, her hands wrapped around an empty tin cup, staring at the stone wall with an expression that Tamsin recognized because she had seen it on the faces of men who survived mine collapses. It was the face of someone who has crossed from doubt to belief through the narrow passage of terror and cannot go back. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the mountain held. The silence from the camp lasted through the storm's 2nd day and into the 3rd. By then, Tamsin had stopped counting hours and was counting breaths and vent clearings. The high vent required clearing every 40 minutes now. The snow outside had compressed against the wall until the outer face was buried to the top course. The door frame had stabilized. The wedge stone Tavi had placed was holding, and the rawhide had stopped stretching because it was frozen solid in its lashing. The interior temperature had dropped 3 degrees from the body heat and breath of 5 people warming the air beyond what the rock could absorb, which meant moisture was condensing on the walls, which meant the bedrolls were damp, which meant Millie was shivering again. Tavi coughed. Once, hard. He turned away from the light and pressed his fist against his mouth. Tamsin saw red between his fingers before he wiped his hand on his leggings. He saw her looking and shook his head. Clear the vent, he said. She cleared the vent. On the 3rd morning, or what they believed was the 3rd morning, based on Tavi's chalk marks and oil burn calculations, the sound of the storm changed. The pressure against the wall eased by a degree Tamsin felt in her back before she understood it with her mind. The high vent cleared more easily. The air that came through was colder and drier. The wet cycle was ending. Whatever remained above was freezing, consolidating, turning from active threat to passive weight. The snow was no longer falling. It was settling. Now? Mara asked. Now we dig, Tavi said. He made Tamsin go first. Not because she was strongest, Mara was stronger, but because Tamsin had the better eye for structure, and the dig-out was as dangerous as the storm. Packed wet snow above an open hole could collapse inward. The angled door gave them a protected pocket to start from, a space where the recessed entry prevented direct overhead packing. Tamsin opened the door against the resistance of compressed snow that had frozen into a solid wall. She chipped at it with the pick, working upward at an angle, following the line of the stone wall's outer face, where the gap between stone and snow provided a natural channel. The first breath of outside air reached her face after 20 minutes of digging. Cold, clean, sharp with the mineral clarity of high altitude. She pushed the pick through the last crust, and gray light flooded the tunnel, and she squinted against a brightness that should not have been blinding, but was, because her eyes had spent 3 days in lamplight and darkness and had forgotten what open sky looked like. She broke through into a world she did not recognize. The camp below was gone, not destroyed in the way she had expected. Roofs caved in, walls standing, wreckage visible, gone, buried. The only features above the snow surface were chimney tops and the upper edge of Price's store, which had survived because its steep roof and center post had done exactly what Tamsin had told the camp to build into every structure. Everything else was white, smooth. The snow had filled the spaces between buildings and leveled them, creating a single unbroken plain that stretched from the creek, itself invisible under ice and drift, to the tree line where spruce branches sagged under loads that bent them to the ground. Mara came through the tunnel behind her. Ida came next, carrying Millie. Tavi came last, moving slowly, one hand against the stone wall. They stood in the snow above the buried camp and heard nothing. No voices, no stamp mills, no mules. The silence was so complete that Tamsin could hear her own pulse in her ears and the creak of Tavi's snowshoe lashing as he shifted his weight. Then, from below the snow and somewhere to the left, a sound, tapping, weak and irregular, but deliberate. Someone alive under the white. Tamsin picked up the shovel. Karkik was alive because a stove corner had held. They found him under the collapsed beam of a cabin he had stayed in to brace, not his own cabin, but one belonging to a miner named Tolef Haugen, whose wife was 8 months along, and whose roof had been the flattest in camp. Karkik had gone there after leaving the sisters' adit, said nothing about what he had seen on the hillside, and started cutting a center post from a spare timber. He had the post vertical when the roof folded. The stove, a cast iron box stove bolted to a stone footer, caught the beam 6 inches above his chest. The beam rested on the stove corner, and the collapsed roof rested on the beam, and 3 feet of wet snow rested on the roof. And Karkik lay in a pocket of air, no larger than a coffin, breathing the cold metallic smell of cast iron and his own blood. Tamsin heard the tapping first. She followed the sound by pressing her ear against the snow surface, moving in a crouch, listening for the rhythm. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps. That meant a conscious mind directing a conscious hand. She dug with the shovel. Mara dug beside her with the pick. The snow was so dense that each shovelful had to be cut before it could be lifted, like slicing bread with a blade too dull for the crust. They reached the beam in 40 minutes. Karkik's face appeared in the gap between iron and wood, gray with dust, one eye swollen shut, blood crusted along his left temple where the beam had grazed him on its way down. He was holding a nail. The tapping had been a 10-penny nail struck against the stove leg. "Haugen's wife," he said. The first words out of his mouth were not about himself. She was in the back room. They found Greta Haugen behind a fallen wall section, curled on her side with her arms around her belly, unconscious but breathing. The back room had partially held because the wall studs had wedged against each other in a triangle that shed the roof load sideways. She had a broken wrist and a gash along her shoulder, and a baby that would come in 3 weeks, whether the camp was standing or not. Tamsin cut the snow away from the beam while Mara levered it with the pick handle. Karkik crawled out on his stomach, dragging his left leg, which had taken the beam's full weight across the shin. Not broken, he could feel his toes, but damaged enough that standing required 2 hands on the nearest solid object and a sound through his teeth that he would not repeat in company. He stood. He looked at Tamsin. She looked back. Neither of them mentioned the conversation in the assay office, the dismissal, the signed title paper, the words about snow-breaking men in slides and not on roofs. There was nothing to say about those words now. The camp had said them for him. "Tell me what to do," Karkik said. It was the most difficult sentence a man like Karkik could form. Authority spent 40 years flowing in one direction, from his experience to other men's ignorance, and reversing that current cost him something that showed in the set of his jaw and the grip of his hands on the beam he was using as a crutch. But he said it, and Tamsin heard it for what it was. Not surrender, but the recognition that competence matters more than pride when people are dying under snow. "Stop digging streets," Tamsin said. "Dig roof pockets. Find the air spaces. Listen for tapping. Start with the buildings that had center posts or stoves. Those create the gaps that keep people alive." Karkir turned to the surviving men who had gathered, 6 miners, bruised and stunned, who had crawled out of buildings that had partially held. He gave the order in the voice of a mine captain directing a rescue crew. And the men moved because Karkik's authority had not disappeared. It had simply found a new channel. By the end of the first day after the storm, they had pulled 14 people from the wreckage. 7 cabins were total losses, roofs folded flat, walls splayed, contents crushed under snow so dense it had to be cut in blocks. 3 structures with center posts and steeper roof lines remained usable, though all required bracing, and 2 had lost their chimneys. Price's store stood because Price had built it right. Steep roof, center post, heavy ridge beam, but his attached warehouse had collapsed, burying flour sacks, tool stock, and lamp oil tins under wet snow that was already freezing into a solid mass. Price himself was unhurt. He had been inside his store when the warehouse went, separated from the collapse by a load-bearing wall he had built with his own money. He stood in his doorway and watched the sisters direct the rescue work, and said nothing for several hours. His silence was not agreement, it was recalculation. The numbers in his head were not about snow load or water equivalent. They were about leverage. 2 men had died. Bram Loden, a shaft miner from Leadville, had been shoveling the cookhouse roof when the eave dropped. They found his glove first, brown leather, fingers curled, protruding from packed snow at an angle that told Tamsin everything before they dug the rest. Ida turned Millie's face away. The second was an older man named Firth, whose cabin had no center post and no stove large enough to catch a beam. He had died in his sleep. The snow had pressed the roof down slowly enough that the sound had not woken him, and the weight had settled on his chest like a hand pressing a child's toy flat. Tamsin did not look at the bodies longer than she had to. She looked at the roofs that had held and the roofs that had failed, and she began building a map in her mind, a pattern that connected pitch angle, bracing, span width, and snow load into a logic that could be taught, repeated, and used by people who had never read a barometer. The adit became the camp's center within 2 days. Not because the sisters declared it, because the mountain declared it. The Blue Mercy held a steady temperature, while outside the snow refroze, and the wind resumed, and the surviving structures groaned under loads they had not been designed to carry. People came to the adit for warmth, for shelter, for the simple reason that the stone wall had done what every cabin in camp had failed to do. By the second night, 14 people slept inside the Blue Mercy. Tamsin organized them the way Tavi had organized her. Positions assigned by airflow, breathing counted, lamps rationed, movement restricted. She checked the high vent every 40 minutes. She ran the smoking wool strip along the walls. She watched the candle flame the way a sailor watches a compass. Miners asked questions. They asked how to brace roofs with center posts, how much pitch a roof needed to shed wet snow, how to build snow tunnels between buried structures, how to turn cellars into refuges, and which mine openings were safe enough to shelter in and which were traps. They asked because the knowledge that had failed them was the only knowledge they had, and the knowledge that had saved them belonged to 2 22-year-old women they had mocked and expelled 3 days earlier. Tamsin answered every question. Mara answered the ones Tamsin missed. They refused payment. They refused credit. They refused everything except one condition. No one enters an untested mine without checking ventilation and roof stability first. She described the tests: candle flame, soot marks, mineral line, the smoking wool strip, and she described the dangers: bad air pooling in low pockets, rotting timber, hidden shafts, oxygen depletion when too many bodies consume too little flow. The mountain can save you, she said, but it does not care whether it saves you or kills you. That is your job to know. Karkik listened to this from the back of the chamber, his injured leg stretched in front of him, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of boiled bean broth. He listened the way a man listens to a language he should have learned years earlier. When the questions ended and the miners settled into their assigned positions for the night, he spoke to Tamsin quietly. I taught men timber for 30 years, he said. I taught them to trust wood because wood was what I knew. I did not listen when rock was the answer. Rock is not always the answer, Tamsin said. The cabins that held had center posts and steep pitch. That is timber and design. Your knowledge was not wrong. It was incomplete. Karkik looked at her. His good eye held an expression she had not seen before. Not the patronizing assessment of the assay office. Not the reluctant inspection of the hillside. Something closer to the way Tavi had looked at her when she fitted a stone correctly, though Karkik would never have recognized the comparison. I will not approve another flat-roofed bunkhouse, he said. Not in this camp. Not in any camp, I captain. Ida Marsh's conversion was quieter. She did not make speeches. She did not apologize for watching from the boarding house window while the deputy escorted the sisters out. She carried Millie on her hip, and Millie's fever was gone and the child was alive because Ida had chosen to climb a hill in a storm toward a mine she believed was a tomb, and that choice had cost her more pride than she would ever admit. She came to Tamsin on the third day and said, "Teach me the coffee tin test." Tamsin showed her. Take a tin can, coffee tin, bean tin, any vessel with straight sides, pack it level with snow from the roof. Melt it on a stove or over a candle. Measure the water line against the snow line. If the water is 1/5 the height of the snow, the ratio is 5-1. If 1/6, 6-1. The lower the ratio, the heavier the snow, the more dangerous the load. Ida practiced it 3 times. The third time, she did it without looking at Tamsin for confirmation. She wrote the ratios on a scrap of paper and tucked it into her apron pocket. Every woman in every camp should know this, Ida said. The men will not listen until the roof is groaning. The women will listen because the women are the ones underneath. Price did not convert. Price adapted. On the 4th day after the storm, while men were still digging tunnels between buried structures, and Karkik was directing roof reinforcement from a chair because his leg would not carry him, Price called a meeting in his store. He stood behind his counter, the same counter where he sold flour at $4 a sack and extended credit at terms that would make a banker wince, and he addressed the surviving camp. The Vale sisters saved lives, he said. I acknowledge it. But sentiment does not rebuild a camp. Someone must coordinate supplies, organize labor, and communicate with Silverton when the trail clears. I propose a recovery committee, with myself as treasurer. It was brilliant in its ugliness. He was not denying the sisters' contribution. He was absorbing it into a structure he controlled. The man who had called their warning economic sabotage was now positioning himself as the manager of the recovery their warning had made necessary. Tamsin saw the maneuver. Mara saw it faster. A recovery committee is useful, Mara said from the back of the store. But the refuge is not committee property. The Blue Mercy sits on the Morning Lark claim, which is filed in our name. The methods we taught are free to anyone. But the adit is ours. Price smiled. It was the smile of a man who had expected resistance and prepared for it. The Morning Lark claim has unpaid assessment fees, he said. $12, purchased by me from the county recorder's office. If those fees are not settled by spring filing, the claim reverts. We know, Tamsin said. We will pay them. With what? The room was silent. $31, minus food, minus lamp oil, minus the supplies they had shared with 14 people for 3 days. The math was visible to everyone. The sisters had spent their savings keeping the camp alive. Price had spent nothing. Karkik stood up, his leg buckled. He caught the counter edge and held himself upright by force of will. I will pay the assessment, he said. $12 from my wages. Consider it a debt to the women who dug me out of a hole. I should have braced myself. Price's smile did not change, but something behind it shifted. He had not expected Karkik. He had expected the sisters to stand alone, the way they had stood alone on the packing crate 3 days before the storm. He had not calculated that survival creates alliances that debt cannot buy. Noted, Price said. The committee will proceed, with or without the adit. Tavi and Karkik met properly on the 5th day, in the adit, over a disagreement about bracing. Karkik wanted to timber the adit entrance, add wooden headers inside the stone wall, create a frame that could be repaired if stones shifted. He drew the plan on the chamber floor with a charcoal stub, the way he had drawn timber plans in Cornish tin mines and Colorado silver tunnels for 30 years. Tavi looked at the plan and said, "You want to put something weak inside something strong. Timber is not weak. Timber flexes, stone cracks. Stone cracks when it is thin. This wall is 5 feet at the base. It does not crack. It distributes. Your timber will rot in 2 seasons. The stone will be here when your grandchildren are dead." They argued for an hour. Tamsin and Mara sat against the back wall and listened to 2 men who had spent their lives understanding different materials, discover that they were both right and both incomplete. Karkik understood spans and loads, and the behavior of wood under compression. Tavi understood mass and angle and the behavior of stone under pressure. Neither understood the other's material well enough to reject it entirely. They built a compromise, cribbed log footers against the stone base, Karkik's contribution, with stone pilasters rising from the footers to the top course, Tavi's contribution. The hybrid brace distributed load through two materials instead of one, and could be repaired in sections without dismantling the wall. They built it together, working in silence for most of the labor, because the work itself was the conversation. When Karkik set a timber joint with a precision that made Tavi nod, and when Tavi fitted a stone cap with a tolerance that made Karkik grunt, those were the sentences that mattered. When they finished, Tamsin saw something she had not seen in the adit before. Two men standing side by side, looking at work they had done together, who 3 days earlier had existed in the same camp without exchanging a word. The stone and the timber touched at every joint, and neither material diminished the other. Tavi weakened. The cough he had hidden in snow became a cough he could not hide. By the second week, when the trail to Silverton was still blocked by slide debris, and the camp was surviving on rationed flour, and the venison Tavi had cached in the upper timber, blood appeared on his lips after every fit. He sat in the back chamber of the Blue Mercy, where the air was warmest, and breathed at the count of 10, and said nothing about what was happening inside his chest. Tamsin knew. She had seen lung fever take men in the camps, the slow drowning that cold and altitude accelerated, the cough that deepened until breathing itself became labor. She sat beside him in the evenings after the rescue work was done, and the teaching was finished, and the camp had settled into the rhythms she had established, and she did not ask how he felt, because asking would have insulted him. He taught until he could not teach. On the last day he was strong enough to stand. He made Tamsin rebuild a vent stone 3 times. The first fitting was good. The second was better. The third was the same as the second, and Tamsin said so. "Look again," Tavi said. She looked. The stone sat flush. The airflow was clean. The gap was sealed. She could not see what was wrong because nothing was wrong. "You are not rebuilding the stone," Tavi said. "You are rebuilding the habit. When I am not here, the stone will still need fitting, and you will need to know that you can fit it without someone telling you to look again." He died 4 days later in the back chamber on the elk hide, with mineral water ticking against rock and the candle flame leaning toward the crack that had kept them all breathing. Mara was asleep. Tamsin was checking the high vent. When she came back down the wall, his chest was still, and his hands were open on the hide, palms up, as if he had been holding something he had decided to release. There is a silence that follows the death of someone who taught you to listen. It is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of everything you know becoming yours alone. Every lesson, every correction, every moment of patience that shaped your hands and your eyes and your understanding of how the world holds together. Tamsin sat beside Tavi's biddy in the dark and held the vent stone in her palm and felt the weight of knowledge that no longer had a source, only a carrier. They buried him in talus above the adit, under angular stones that bit into each other the way he had taught them to stack. Karkik helped carry the stones. Ida brought a wool blanket to wrap the body. Mara said nothing at the burial, because there was nothing to say that the stones did not say better. If this story reminds you that preparation matters most before disaster arrives, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the sisters' work was far from finished. The secondary crisis came in early April, while snow still locked the upper trails, and the camp was learning to function inside the systems the sisters had built. Leora Pennock was 26, married to a placer miner who had gone to Silverton before the storm, and had not returned. She was 9 months pregnant. She was living in a half-cul-de-sac cabin on the lower street, sharing a stove with 2 other women whose husbands were also missing, and she started labor on a Tuesday morning when the temperature dropped back below 0, and a second, smaller storm sealed the trail that a rescue party had been trying to clear. Ida brought the news to the adit. She was out of breath, and her face carried the look Tamsin had learned to read, not panic, but the controlled urgency of a woman who understood that time was the only resource that could not be rationed. Leora is in labor, Ida said. The cabin is losing heat. The stove flue is half blocked. She cannot stay there. Bring her here, Tamsin said. Price's storeroom is closer. He has a working stove and a flat floor, and Price will demand a debt note before he opens the door. Ida's silence confirmed it. She had already asked. Price had named his terms, a signed note against Leora's husband's placer claim, payable upon return. The price of warmth was ownership. Tamsin did not waste time on anger. She organized. Mara and 2 miners cleared a snow tunnel from the lower street to the Adit trail. Ida and a woman named Barbara Stensland carried Leora through the tunnel on a canvas stretcher improvised from a tent panel and 2 shovel handles. The journey took 40 minutes. Leora screamed twice. The sound echoed through the snow tunnel and came out the other end as a moan that the men on the surface heard and could not identify. Inside the Blue Mercy, Tamsin faced the problem Tavi had trained her, for without Tavi beside her to confirm. 20 people had used the adit in the past week. Now 21, counting Leora, and soon 22. The air budget was the calculation that mattered. She counted breaths the way Tavi had taught her. She checked the high vent, clear. The low vent, she had rebuilt it after the storm, wider, with a better snow baffle, was drawing. But 20 bodies produced heat and moisture and consumed oxygen at a rate the 2 channels had never been tested against. She made decisions. Open the high channel to its maximum width. Pull the restrictor stone she had placed to moderate cold air inflow. Rotate bodies away from the entrance where condensation was worst. No unnecessary lamps. 1 candle for the berth, placed where Ida could see to work. Everyone else in the back chamber, breathing at the count of 10. Can the air hold? Mara asked. Tamsin held the smoking wool strip at the high vent. The smoke moved, pulling inward. Steady. She moved it to the low vent. Steady. She held it at knee height in the center of the chamber. It rose and drifted toward the high vent, carried on the convection of 20 warm bodies in cold rock air. It holds, she said, but if someone panics, it changes. Keep them quiet. Keep them breathing at count. Leora's labor lasted 9 hours. Ida and Barbara attended. The rest of the camp sat in the back chamber in darkness and counted breaths and listened to sounds that most of them had never heard and all of them understood. When the baby cried, a sharp, thin sound that bounced off stone walls and multiplied into an echo that filled the entire adit, Mara laughed. It was the first laughter inside the Blue Mercy since before the storm. It released something that had been coiled in every chest for weeks. And for a moment the chamber was full of sound and heat and the specific, unrepeatable chaos of a new life arriving in a place that had been built to prevent death. Tamsin checked the candle flame. It leaned toward the back chamber, clean and steady. The air held. She stepped outside through the tunnel and stood in the cold above the buried camp and breathed the dry, sharp air of altitude and felt the stone beneath her boots in the absence beside her where Tavi should have been standing. She held the vent stone in her coat pocket, the one he had made her fit 3 times, and pressed it until the edges bit her palm. The mountain breathed. The camp was learning, and the sisters had become the thing no one in Argent Spur had expected them to be. Not miners, not freighters, not laundresses, but the people who understood what the mountain was saying and could translate it for everyone who had never learned to listen. Price made his next move while Leora was still nursing. He sent a letter to Silverton with the first freight driver, who cleared the lower trail. The letter was addressed to a land agent named Coswell, who specialized in distressed mining claims. In it, Price described the Blue Mercy Adit as a developed prospect with shelter improvements, and suggested that the Adit's location, near the disputed boundary of the Morning Lark claim, might actually fall within the survey lines of an older, lapsed filing. A filing Price had conveniently purchased from the recorder's office 6 months before the storm. Tamsin did not know about the letter. She learned about the boundary dispute from Karkik, who had heard it from a miner named Arn Tavit, who had heard Price dictating to the freight driver outside his store. He is trying to take the Adit through paper, Karkik said. If the boundary falls his way, the Blue Mercy sits on his claim not yours. Everything you built becomes his property. Can he do that? He can try it at the spring hearing in Silverton. And he has the kind of friends in the recorder's office who make trying very effective. Tamsin looked at the stone wall, the wall she had built with torn hands and split palms, the wall Tavi had corrected and Mara had hauled stone for, and Ida had brought beans to, the wall that had held against 30,000 pounds of wet snow because every stone leaned into the mountain the way Tavi taught. She could not fight Price with paper. She did not have paper. She did not have a land agent. She did not have friends in the recorder's office. She had a title document signed by Karkik, a camp full of people who owed her their lives, and a stone wall that was not going to move. Then we bring the camp to the hearing, she said. The spring hearing in Silverton was held in the county courthouse on a Tuesday in late April, in a room that smelled of pine resin and tobacco and the particular staleness of paper that has been handled by too many men with too much authority. The judge was a territorial appointee named Aldrich Fenn, who had been deciding claim disputes since before the Bruneau Agreement, and who regarded mining camps the way a schoolmaster regards a room of unruly children, with patience eroded past repair. Price arrived first. He wore a pressed coat. His boots were clean. He carried a leather case containing his boundary sketch, his purchased filing on the lapsed claim, and a letter from Coswell, the land agent, attesting to the survey lines. He looked like a man who had prepared for a negotiation he expected to win, because every negotiation Price had entered in the San Juans had been won by the man with the cleanest boots and the most paper. Tamsin arrived with Mara, Karkik, Ida, and 11 miners from Argent Spur. They had walked the 14 miles from the camp on a trail that was still choked with slide debris and melt runoff. Karkik walked on a splinted leg with a spruce crutch under each arm. Ida carried Millie on her back. 3 of the miners had frostbite scars on their hands from the dig-out. They filled the back of the courtroom and sat on benches that creaked under the weight of men who had spent the last month digging out a buried camp with the tools and methods 2 young women had taught them. Price presented his case with the fluency of a man who understood courtrooms better than he understood mountains. The Blue Mercy adit, he argued, sat within the survey lines of the Garnet Cross filing, a lapsed prospect he'd purchased from the recorder's office in September of the previous year. The Morning Lark claim, filed by Eben Vale in 1879, had never been properly surveyed. The sisters' title paper was based on a verbal description and a sketch that did not match the current county plat. Therefore, the adit and all improvements on it belonged to the Garnet Cross filing. Therefore, they belonged to Price. He unfolded his boundary sketch on the judge's table. It was clean, precise, and drawn by someone who understood how lines on paper could swallow a mountain. Tamsin stood. She had no leather case. She had no land agent's letter. She had a title paper stained with blood and charcoal and bean broth, signed by Jory Karkik in the assay office on the day she arrived. She placed it on the table beside Price's sketch. "I am not a surveyor," she said. "I cannot argue lines on paper. I can tell you what is on the ground." Judge Fenn looked at her with the expression of a man who had heard 1,000 claim disputes and recognized a new kind immediately. "Go on," he said. The Blue Mercy adit was cut from the south face of the ridge, following a silver vein that runs perpendicular to the Morning Lark drift. The Morning Lark enters from the east. The 2 prospects share no geology and no drift line. The Garnet Cross filing was purchased 6 months before the storm by a man who never set foot on the claim, never drove a single drill hole, and never intended to mine. He intended to own paper. "That is speculation about motive," Price said. "It is observation about behavior," Tamsin replied. "You bought the filing in September. You offered to buy our claim for $12 in March. You placed a debt notice on our assessment fees. And when the storm proved that the adit was worth more as a refuge than a mine, you wrote to a land agent in Silverton to redraw the boundary." Price's expression did not change. His hands, resting on the leather case, tightened. Karkik stood. It cost him visible effort. The crutches made sounds against the wooden floor that drew every eye in the room. "I am Jory Karkik," he said. "Mine captain, 30 years underground in Cornwall and Colorado." I have surveyed more claims in San Juan County than most men have filed. I brought the original mine survey of the Blue Mercy prospect. He produced it, a yellowed sheet, hand-drawn, stamped with the county surveyor's seal from 1880. The survey showed the Blue Mercy adit opening clearly outside the boundaries of any adjacent filing. The Garnet Cross claim, as originally surveyed, terminated 42 feet south of the adit mouth. Price's redrawn boundary had shifted the line north. The original had not. Judge Fenn laid the two documents side by side. The discrepancy was visible without magnification. Price's sketch moved a line. The original survey had placed it. The Garnet Cross filing boundary, as recorded in the county plat of 1880, terminates south of the adit in question, Fenn said. The sketch presented by Mr. Price does not match the recorded survey. I am not inclined to redraw county boundaries on the basis of a private sketch submitted 6 months after purchase. Then Ida stood. She did not wait to be recognized. She reached into her apron pocket and produced a ledger, Price's own credit ledger, which she had taken from the boarding house kitchen, where Price had left it during the storm evacuation. Page 14, Ida said, dated March 18th, 4 days before the storm. Victor Price, a purchase offer for the Morning Lark claim, filed against Tamsin and Mara Vale, $12. Noted in Price's own hand as, and I will read his words, acquisition before storm season, value expected to increase with Eastern interest. The courtroom was quiet. Price's expression did not crack, but the muscles in his jaw moved the way muscles move when a man is biting the inside of his cheek hard enough to taste blood. He knew, Ida said. Not about the snow, about the value. He wanted the claim before the sisters could prove it. And when they proved it by saving the camp he tried to empty, he tried to take it through paper instead. Judge Fenn ruled the Morning Lark claim valid as filed. He ruled the Blue Mercy adit within its boundaries. He noted the discrepancy in Price boundary sketch and recommended the county recorder review the Garnet Cross filing for irregularities. He did not call Price a fraud. He did not need to. The room had heard what it needed to hear. Price gathered his leather case. He walked toward the door. As he passed Tamsin, he stopped. Not close. The courtroom was too public for menace, but close enough. You have made charity expensive, he said. Tamsin looked at him. She thought of the $12 offer, the debt notice, the disturbance complaint, the deputy at dawn, the mockery in the street, the sign on the mule. She thought of Bram Loden's glove in the snow and Firth's silent cabin and the flat roofs that had killed them. She thought of all the small calculations Price had made, numbers on paper, leverage in ledgers, value extracted from other people's desperation, and she thought about the one calculation he had never made, which was the weight of snow on the structures he rented to the men he charged. No, she said, we made neglect visible. Price left. He did not leave Argent Spur. Men like Price do not leave places where credit is owed, but he never again challenged the sisters' claim, and he never again stood in a public room and called their warning panic. His diminishment was not dramatic. It was the slow erosion of authority that happens when a community discovers it can survive without the man who told them survival was his business. Orrin Bale arrived in Argentspur 6 weeks after the storm, driving a wagon loaded with forge tools, roof irons, and a portable anvil that weighed more than the mule pulling it. He was 30, broad across the shoulders in the way that smithwork builds. Not the bulk of a man who lifts weights for show, but the dense functional mass of a man who swings a 4-pound hammer 8 hours a day and does not consider it exercise. His hair was black, and his hands were scarred with the constellation of small burns that every blacksmith wears like a second signature. He had come from Ouray, where the Reconstruction news had reached the saloons, and someone had mentioned that a camp above Animas Forks needed a smith. He found the Blue Mercy before he found the camp. He had taken a wrong trail fork and emerged on the upper slope, and the first thing he saw was the stone wall, gray, battered, clay-patched, with a wedge-shaped door and 2 vent openings, and a woman sitting on the top course eating cold beans with a spoon. Mara looked down at him. He looked up at her. The mule behind him shifted its weight, and the anvil clanged against the forge bellows. You are sitting on a mine, he said. I am sitting on a refuge, Mara said. Is there a difference? About 30,000 pounds of snow. Come inside and I will show you. He came inside. He looked at the wall from the interior, the batter angle, the stone courses, the hybrid brace that Tavi and Karkik had built together. He ran his hand along the door frame and tested the hinge points and examined the rawhide lashing and the iron straps salvaged from the ore chute. He said nothing for several minutes. When he spoke, his first question was not about survival or snow or how many people the chamber could hold. The third hinge, he said. You used rawhide because the iron broke. It snapped when I tried to straighten it, Tamsin said from the back chamber. The iron was cast, not forged. Cast iron snaps under lateral stress. Forged iron bends. He pulled a strap hinge from his wagon, handmade, tapered, with a curve that allowed movement without binding. I brought 40 of these. I did not know what they were for until now. He replaced all 3 hinge points that afternoon. He forged vent grates to prevent animal intrusion while maintaining airflow. He built a door frame reinforcement from wrought iron that seated against the stone without bolting through it, distributing the pressure load across a wider surface. He worked the way Tavi had worked, with precision and silence, and the occasional grunt that served as commentary. Mara watched him work. Not with the assessment of a woman evaluating a suitor, with the assessment of a builder evaluating a builder. She understood metal the way she understood stone, by watching how it behaved under force. And Oren's iron behaved the way good iron behaves, which is to say it did what he told it to do. He did not court her with words. He courted her with vent grates and hinge straps and roof braces, and a set of iron snow anchors he designed for the steeper roofs, driven into the ridge beam to hold shedding planks that Karkik greased with tallow. Each piece of work was a sentence in a conversation conducted through metal and fire, and the shared understanding that building things well is its own form of respect. Ora said yes on a Thursday in June in the back chamber of the Blue Mercy, standing on the spot where Tavi had died and where Leora's baby had been born. And Oren put a ring on her finger that he had forged from a silver fragment pulled from the morning lark drift, the only color the claim ever produced, bent into a circle and polished on a leather strop. Tamsin stood witness. Karkik stood witness. Ida held Millie's hand, and Millie held a candle, and the flame leaned toward the back chamber the way it always did, drawn by the air that moved through the mountain. By the following winter, Argent Spur had 3 marked refuges. The Blue Mercy remained the primary station. Tamsin had expanded it. 2 stone sleeping benches along the walls, 3 marked air channels with forged grates, an outer snow shed built from cribbed logs and stone, a second escape crawl that exited 30 feet upslope through a natural crack Tavi had never mentioned, but Tamsin had found by following soot marks, and a posted tally board that tracked barometer readings, snow water ratios, and roof loads across the camp. The assay cellar, rebuilt after the collapse, deepened, fitted with a stone-lined entrance and a ventilation pipe that Oren forged from sheet iron, served as the secondary shelter. It held 12 people and had a direct snow tunnel to the boarding house. The schoolhouse had been reinforced with center posts, a steepened roof, and stone footers poured into the crawl space. Karkik had designed the bracing. The sisters had approved the roof pitch. Oren had forged the connections. It held 20 in an emergency and served as the community meeting place. Every cabin in camp kept a center post cut and ready, leaning against the wall near the stove, marked with the owner's initials and the roof span measurement, so the post could be set in minutes. Roofs had been repitched where possible. Snow-shedding planks, greased with tallow, lined the steepest faces. Every cabin had a shovel inside and a shovel outside. The outside shovel was mounted on the wall at a height of 6 feet, the calculated maximum for a wet snow event, so it could be reached from above if the ground-level entrance was buried. Children knew the warning bell. 3 slow rings meant roof clearing, every person on their roof with a shovel, working from the ridge down. 5 rings meant refuge movement, families to their assigned shelter, carrying their emergency sack, which contained a blanket, a candle, a tin of beans, and a card with breathing instructions written by Tamsin in block letters. Mara taught the children. She held classes in the schoolhouse on Saturday mornings while Oren repaired tools and Tamsin walked the camp checking barometers and roof loads. The children learned to listen for roof groans, the low creaking sound that timber makes when snow load exceeds the beam's tolerance. They learned to read the coffee tin test. They learned that wet snow sticks to their mittens and dry snow blows off, and that the snow that sticks is the snow that kills. Tamsin developed the warning system into a checklist. Barometer drop, measure and record twice daily. Warm, wet air at elevation. Note wind direction. Check for south or southwest flow, carrying Gulf moisture up the valleys. Roof crust depth. Measure weekly with a marked stick. Animal behavior. Note when ravens feed low, when snow fleas emerge, when mules refuse the upper trail. Shovel test weight. Pack a coffee tin, melt it, read the ratio. She posted the checklist on the wall of every cabin, written in English and in the German that Greta Hauwagen's husband spoke, and in a rough phonetic transcription that Karkik had adapted for the Cornish miners who read poorly. The checklist was not elegant. It was legible. And it worked because it translated the knowledge Tavi had carried in his body and his memory into marks on paper that anyone could follow. The second winter tested the system. A storm in January brought 4 feet of wet snow in 36 hours. The barometer had warned them 2 days ahead. Tamsin rang 3 bells at dawn. Every roof in camp was cleared before the first flake fell. When the snow accumulated past the shedding capacity of the steeper roofs, she rang 5. Families moved to their assigned shelters carrying their emergency sacks. Children walked in lines, holding hands, following the snow tunnels that had been dug and maintained since October. No one died. No roof collapsed. The Blue Mercy held 14 people for 2 nights while the storm passed. The assay cellar held 8. The schoolhouse held 16. When the skies cleared, the camp dug out in organized shifts, following routes Tamsin had mapped. And within 4 days, the street was open and the stamp mill was running. Karkik stood in the street after the dig-out and looked at the roofs and the posts and the shovels and the bell tower and the tunnels and the tally boards and the children who walked to their shelters without being told twice. This is what a camp looks like when it listens, he said to no one in particular. Then he walked to the schoolhouse to check the center posts, because Jory Karkik had not survived 30 years underground by trusting that the work was finished. The years compress the way years do when work replaces crisis and routine replaces terror. Mara married Oren in the Blue Mercy and bore 2 children, a boy named for Tavi and a girl named for their mother. They kept the refuge supplied after Argent Spur's silver veins thinned and the camp began its slow decline. Oren forged roof irons for camps across the San Juans, and Mara traveled with him, teaching the coffee tin test and the breathing count and the checklist to women in Silverton, Eerie, Telluride, and Lake City, who had never heard of Argent Spur, but who understood immediately why snow that sticks to your mitten is the snow that kills. Tamsin never married. Men offered. She declined without explanation, not from grief or principle, but because the work she did required a solitude she had chosen and did not want to share. She became known as the woman who could read snow by weight, a reputation that sounded like folklore but was grounded in the barometer readings and coffee tin ratios and shovel tests she had cataloged for years. She advised mine captains on bunkhouse design. She testified at 2 more claim hearings, both times against men who had tried to take credit for methods they had not built. She kept the Blue Mercy maintained long after the last miner left Argent Spur, oiling the hinges, replacing the vent grates, stacking beans in sealed tins in the back chamber. Karkik spent his last working years refusing to approve flat-roofed bunkhouses. He carried a copy of Tamsin's checklist in his coat pocket and consulted it before signing any construction plan. He died in Silverton at 67 in a boarding house with a steep roof and a center post, and the obituary in the newspaper mentioned his Cornish mining career and did not mention the storm. But the miners who had been in Argent Spur remembered, and at his funeral they stood in a line and tapped 3 times on the coffin lid, the way Karkik had tapped a nail against a stove leg in the dark under a collapsed beam, and the sound carried through the church like a conversation between wood and stone. Ida ran the emergency storehouse until her knees gave out. Then she ran it from a chair. Millie Hask grew up and married a surveyor, and named her first daughter to Hamsin. And the child grew up hearing a story about a fever and a stone wall, and a woman who opened a door in a blizzard because a 7-year-old was too important to leave behind. Years after the storm, a young miner arrived in what remained of Argent Spur. The camp was mostly empty by then. 3 standing structures, a silted creek, tailings piles greening over with scrub willow. The young miner found the Blue Mercy on the hillside and looked at the stone wall and the iron-grated vents and the wedge-shaped door with its forged hinges, and said the thing that young men say when they encounter something built by people whose fear they have never shared. Women's panic, he said, made permanent. Karkik was not there to answer. He was 5 years in the ground. But Tamsin was there. She was sitting on the top course of the wall, the same place Mara had sat when Oren first appeared with his anvil, and she was eating cold beans with a spoon, because some habits outlast the reasons that created them. "Put your shoulder to the door," she said. "Push." The young miner pushed. The door did not move. The wedge frame seated tighter. The iron held. The stone held. The mountain behind the stone held. The young miner pushed until his boots slid in the mud, and his face reddened, and the veins in his neck stood out. And the door did not move because it had been designed by a woman who understood that the force against it was the force that held it shut. He stepped back. He looked at the door. He looked at Tamsin. "Who built this?" he asked. "2 sisters," Tamsin said. "A Ute tracker, a Cornish timberman, a cook with 20 pounds of beans, a blacksmith with 40 hinge straps, and a mountain that did not care who lived or died, but held the weight regardless." Within 2 winters of the storm, the Vale method had spread to 6 neighboring camps as a practical checklist. Roof pitch calculated against wet snow load, center posts cut to span and kept ready, snow water testing with the coffee tin method, adit ventilation verified before shelter use, and emergency food caches sealed and stored above the floodline. It did not spread as a revolution. It spread the way useful knowledge spreads in places where dying is common and prevention is cheap. 1 checklist nailed to 1 wall, 1 woman teaching 1 neighbor, 1 bell pattern learned by 1 child who grew up and taught it to the next. Tamsin lived out her later years near Silverton, in a cabin with a steep roof and a center post and a barometer on the wall that she checked every morning before she checked anything else. She kept a vent stone on the shelf beside her bed, angular, fractured, sharp-edged. The stone Tavi had made her fit 3 times. She held it some mornings the way other people hold photographs, pressing the edges into her palm until she could feel the shape of everything it meant. She died in her sleep at 59, in a winter that was dry and cold and light, the kind of winter that does not test roofs, and the women of Silverton buried her beside Tavi in the talus above the Blue Mercy, under stones that leaned into the mountain. The camp had called it Schoolhouse Panic. Price had said the Vale twins thought snow could turn to stone. He was wrong, but not in the way he imagined. Snow did not turn to stone. It turned heavy, heavy enough to test every structure, every assumption, and every authority that had been trusted to wood, debt, and pride. It turned heavy enough to reveal who had built for the weight they could see, and who had built for the weight they refused to believe. The Blue Mercy still stands. The iron straps are rust dark. The vent grates are packed with decades of pine needles and mineral deposit. The wedge-shaped door hangs on forged hinges in a frame that has not shifted since the spring of 1884. The stone wall still leans into the mountain, holding nothing now but the memory of pressure and the silence of a place where the air once moved because a man taught a woman to listen for the mountain's breath. The town had laughed because the sisters feared the weight of snow, and then the mountain proved them right.